Your worst sin, Nietzsche might argue, is that you have destroyed and betrayed yourself for someone else's idea of who you should be. The trouble is that this line is usually served up as a sort of spiritual pat on the head, a pleasing little slogan which tells us that authenticity consists in affirming whatever we already happen to be, which is marvelous news for our egos, and rather less marvelous for Nietzsche. My name is Josh Martin, and this is Silent Mind Academy. Self-help culture strips philosophical ideas down to slogans at a remarkable rate. Take the office poster that tells you to become who you are, while hanging above a spreadsheet no human being should have to look at before coffee. Nietzsche gets turned into a scented candle for middle management, not a physician of the soul, but HR with a tragic moustache and suspiciously good branding. But Nietzsche specifically warned against exactly this kind of comfortable self-affirmation, calling it the most seductive form of self-betrayal available to modern people. The philosophers who get turned into poster quotes are almost always the ones whose actual arguments would incinerate the poster. But there is one nastier complication here. What if the self you are affirming does not yet exist? Nietzsche borrows "Become who you are" from Pindar, a Greek poet writing about athletic excellence through grueling effort. That matters, because if you hear the line as permission to just be yourself, you are not merely being a bit sloppy, you are mistaking training for essence and comfort for destiny. What you gain, if you take it seriously, is harsher and better. Not self-expression, but self-formation, which is much less marketable and far more useful. Miss that context, and you miss everything. You are not uncovering a self that was always there. You are forging one under conditions you did not choose and cannot fully control. And Pindar is not talking about authenticity in the modern therapeutic sense. That sacred ritual in which one buys a nicer notebook, circles one's core values, and waits for the cosmos to applaud. He is talking about discipline, rank, measure, ordeal, the sort of excellence that appears natural only after it has been paid for in repetition and strain. The athlete looks born for the contest, right up until you notice the regimen. That is very close to Nietzsche's opening move. Before there is a stable who, there is a disorderly bundle of drives, impulses, inheritances, vanities, borrowed moral vocabulary, accidental wounds, and social mimicry stitched together with alarming confidence. We call this a personality, largely because saying, "I am a temporary coalition of quarreling forces," is terrible for networking. This is why the line lands with such force. It is not addressed to a finished substance, but to a task. The self, on this view, is less a hidden treasure chest buried in the psyche than a legal fiction that has not yet earned its paperwork. You do not consult it, you compose it. And composition, unfortunately, involves selection. The trouble is, if the self is a task, why does Nietzsche place that command in a book with so peculiar a title? Ecce Homo was written in 1888, weeks before Nietzsche's complete mental collapse. But most people who quote "become who you are" picture it scrawled in a wellness journal, not composed at the edge of a breakdown, by a man who knew exactly how little time he had left. That biographical pressure changes everything about what the line is actually asking of you. It appears there as a subtitle, attached to a book whose title means "Behold the Man," which is not exactly the branding strategy of a chirpy morning routine influencer. Ecce Homo is not a manual in the modern sense at all. It is part autobiography, part philosophical performance, part act of self-interpretation, conducted with the theatrical confidence of a man introducing himself and cross-examining himself at the same time. Nietzsche does not present a tidy program, 3 habits before breakfast, and a downloadable worksheet for becoming your best authentic self. Mercifully, what he offers instead is a retrospective account of how a life, with all its illnesses, severances, strange compulsions, and long gestations can be read as if it possessed style. That placement matters, because a subtitle in such a book does different work from a slogan on a tote bag. It is not a generic imperative addressed to anyone whatsoever, as though one might issue it alongside hydrate, manifest, and answer emails. It is bound up with the question of authorship. Who has the right to say what one is, and by what discipline of interpretation that is has been earned? In Ecce Homo, Nietzsche is staging a reckoning with his own corpus, treating books, symptoms, and choices as though they were clues in a case file assembled by an unusually literary detective who, rather inconveniently, is also the suspect. And there is a comic severity to that setting. The phrase arrives wearing evening dress, not gym kit, except if that command is not generic advice, why do so many people turn it into permission to remain exactly as they are? Motivational posts quote Nietzsche's "Become who you are" roughly 10,000 times a day across social platforms. But the version they're quoting has had its spine removed. Is Nietzsche telling you to relax into your essence, or to wage war against your habits? For him, growth is not self-expression, in the sense of posting your breakfast with better boundaries. It is a discipline of refusal, of finding what in you is second-hand, timid, inherited, and then learning, often rather painfully, not to obey it. Nietzsche's actual self-overcoming demands that you identify the parts of yourself you most admire, then treat them as the next obstacle to defeat. That is the bit the inspirational quote card tends to leave out, presumably because interrogate your highest virtues until they start to look suspicious pairs rather badly with a pastel mountain background. Nietzsche does not merely ask you to overcome your laziness, your fear, your obviously shabby impulses. He asks whether your strengths have become hiding places. Courage can harden into theatre. Kindness can become a strategy for avoiding conflict. Intelligence, that darling of YouTube essayists and other suspiciously pale indoor creatures, can become a velvet-lined bunker in which one explains life instead of living it. And to do so, he pushes far beyond the ordinary moral vocabulary of self-improvement. This is not the cheerful Protestant spreadsheet of becoming a bit more disciplined, waking up earlier, drinking more water, and perhaps acquiring the glow of a particularly successful houseplant. It is a revaluation within the person, a refusal to let any achieved form become sacred simply because it is familiar. One does not overcome only one's vices. One overcomes one's settled style, one's favorite mask, one's little private mythology about the sort of person I am. The awkward question is, once you start cutting away the masks, how do you tell whether anything distinctly yours remains? Nietzsche's sculptor metaphor assumes your identity is not a seed waiting to flower, but a block of stone requiring subtraction. That sounds severe, and it is. But the surprise is that the violence is aimed less at creating a self than at removing the crowd you have mistaken for one. Inherited pieties, social reflexes, little moral ventriloquisms speaking through your face. Michelangelo gets invoked here for a reason. The statue does not arrive by positive thinking, yet most people treat self-development as addition, piling on new habits, new aesthetics, new personality traits, as if the self were a shopping trolley rather than a quarry. The metaphor only works in one direction, and it is not the comfortable one. What must be cut away, crucially, is often precisely what feels most intimate, because custom has a nasty habit of dressing itself up as character. The opinion you defend most theatrically may be little more than a family heirloom, with better branding, and the ambition you call your dream may turn out to be a very obedient response to applause. Awkward, slightly rude of philosophy to point this out, but there we are. And this is why the sculptor image is harsher than the usual therapeutic slogan about authenticity. A sculptor does not consult the marble about its preferences, nor does he ask every stray chip to remain in place in case it has developed a rich inner life. He works by refusal. Form appears through disciplined exclusion. In Nietzschean terms, that means style is not decoration added at the end. It is the result of rank ordering one's drives, deciding which impulses command and which obey, which capacities deserve cultivation, and which appetites, however lively, deserve to be told no and shown the door. But there is a difficulty here, and it is not a small one. If you remove too timidly, you preserve clutter. If you remove too crudely, you shatter the figure altogether. Anyone who has attempted to revise a sentence, a career, or a personality before breakfast will know the feeling. And here, the real nuisance begins. Because if every decisive cut hurts, how do you know suffering is carving you, rather than merely breaking you? Amor Fati demands something most consolation philosophies carefully avoid. Not that you endure your suffering, but that you desire it. That sounds monstrous, until you notice how people typically speak. When hardship later becomes part of their authorship, the illness they would never choose, the failure they still curse, and yet the ordeal, without which their standards, loyalties, even their style of seeing, would be unrecognizable. Nietzsche is asking for retrospective affirmation, a brutal ask. Miss that distinction, and the whole concept collapses into a slightly pretentious version of looking on the bright side, which is precisely what Nietzsche despised. He is not recommending gratitude journaling with better cheekbones. He is asking whether you can say yes to the very sequence of events that formed the rank order of your soul, whether you can affirm not merely the pleasant episodes, but the humiliations, delays, embarrassments, and absurd little degradations that educated your taste more effectively than any schoolmaster ever could. This is why Amor Fati sits so close to the thought of eternal recurrence. If you were forced to live this exact life again, detail by detail, could you bear it without secretly filing an appeal? And there is a complication here that makes people understandably twitchy. To affirm suffering is not to call evil good, nor to recommend passivity in the face of cruelty, which would be a rather nasty moral fiasco, dressed up as profundity. Nietzsche is not offering a victim theology with better prose. The point is harder and stranger. Once pain has entered the structure of a life, the question becomes whether one treats it as meaningless vandalism alone, or whether one can metabolize it into character, discrimination, discipline, even a sharper capacity for joy. Not because suffering is holy. It isn't. Often, it is just ghastly. There is, however, an awkward snag. Because the moment suffering becomes material for growth, you may start mistaking ease for failure. Nietzsche called comfort the most insidious form of self-betrayal. Not because suffering is noble, but because ease quietly convinces you the self you have is the self you were meant to become. Ignore that, and what you risk is not merely stagnation, but a kind of elegant domestication. A life arranged so efficiently around convenience that nothing in you is ever asked to sharpen. Apply it, however, and you gain friction, discernment, and the unnerving privilege of finding capacities that comfort, rather rudely, keeps sedated. That is why modern therapeutic culture so often misreads him. It hears "be yourself" and translates it into "protect your peace, honor your boundaries, buy the candle," and, if things become especially dire, take a bath and call it metaphysics. A bit unfair, perhaps. I like a bath. But Nietzsche's objection is not to rest. It is to arrangements of life that make challenge optional, that turn every difficulty into a design flaw to be removed, rather than a demand to be answered. Comfort, in his sense, is not a soft blanket, but a whole moral atmosphere. It rewards predictability, praises harmlessness, and teaches you to confuse the absence of conflict with the presence of health. The result is a personality with excellent manners and very few muscles. One becomes highly adapted to one's cage. And there is another wrinkle here, because comfort is rarely experienced as decadence from the inside. It feels sensible, mature, even. You take the safer job, keep the safer opinions, remain the version of yourself that other people can index without effort, and because no catastrophe follows, you assume the choice was wise. Yet for Nietzsche, one of the great dangers of a diminished life is precisely that it does not announce itself dramatically. It arrives, upholstered, reasonable, and well-reviewed by your peers, which is precisely why he is so irritating to modern common sense. We are trained to treat strain as a warning label, as though difficulty were always evidence that something has gone wrong, when for Nietzsche, it is often the only medium in which rank, discipline, and style can form at all. A violin string left slack does not become more authentic, it becomes useless. And in human beings, this slackness can look wonderfully respectable, endless optimization, careful self-protection, a calendar full of manageable obligations, not a single outright disaster, and yet no ascent either. One remains intact, splendidly intact. Yet if staying intact is the danger, by what cruel standard are you meant to judge the life that comfort has so politely arranged? Most people treat the self as a given, something already present, waiting to be noticed. But Nietzsche's notebooks describe the self as a project that only coheres under pressure, the way a sentence only means something once you've committed to its final word. The catch, every version of you that feels natural is probably just the version that has stopped being challenged. That is rather inconvenient, because it means authenticity is not a mood, but a discipline of selection, a long campaign of saying no to impulses that arrive wearing your face and claiming diplomatic immunity. Nietzsche is maddening on this point. He does not flatter spontaneity. He suspects it, especially when it looks suspiciously like obedience in casual clothes. Your instincts are often ventriloquists, culture supplies, the voice, and you applaud. You may feel exposed. Good. That means the mask is losing oxygen. I am curious of your thought in comments. Welcome to Silent Mind Academy.